Uh, I'm a sociologist, and I'm very impressed with all the statistics that you've been sharing with us. I was taught as a student at Oxford that statistics was introduced into sociology to prevent it from deteriorating into philosophy. So, thank you for that. It's a great honor to stand before you today to pay tribute to Professor Makgoba. Mine is going to be a personal reflection. It's clear from his scholarly achievement that he is a distinguished immunologist and a global leader in HIV vaccine research. I think what's in preparation for this occasion, I looked at Professor Makgoba's publications, and there are 80 peer-reviewed articles going back to 1981. I think what is striking about these publications that they continue throughout his period as a Vice-Chancellor. I think that's quite exceptional. And he stands out as the most productive scholarly Vice-Chancellor we've ever had in South Africa. Even during the period of turmoil, the troubles, as Dr. Kluti has put it, he was producing scholarly articles in leading journals. And I think that really maybe brings out a slight paradox for us, because what Professor Makgoba is associated with is his contribution to the transformation of the higher education system. But there's another identity, almost a kind of hidden identity, and that is his identity as a leading scholar. But today, I'm going to reflect on his role as a pioneer in higher education transformation, and in particular, his period at WITS from 1994 to 1998. And I want to make 3 points. I arrived from the United Kingdom in Durban 42 years ago at the height of apartheid. By the way, the designation Professor Emeritus simply means that you're old. And my position on that is that growing old is better than the alternative. I was met at the airport by the head of department, immaculately dressed in a safari suit, in a hot, humid Sunday afternoon in February 1973. Now, the University of Natal at the time was a parochial, laid-back institution dominated by what we used to call ONFs, Old Natal Families. I mean, I think it's interesting. I don't think there was more than one, possibly 2 PhDs in the department. And I noticed you, Dr. Kluti, mentioned that Professor Makgoba feels you're only half an academic if you don't have a PhD. Okay, it's a bit like being pregnant. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You're either pregnant or not. You're either an academic or you're not, and you've got a PhD. Of course, below the surface, an incredible energy was boiling over, which erupted in what came to be known as the Durban moment. Strikes, vital discussions, Steve Biko, Richard Turner, and others. But this was not visible in the common room conversations, which were dominated, as I recall, by detailed advice on how to deal with cockroaches. The horse races, that was a very important, and of course the many beaches in and around Durban. Publication of academic articles was rare, and the academic boycott ensured that international recognition was seldom given or indeed sought. Today, UKZN is a very different place, described as, I quote, the most transformed higher education institution and the most research productive university in South Africa. Now, of course, that's in your own words, Professor Potgieter, but I take them to be true. And with the highest number of academic publications in all universities in South Africa. Now, this is an extraordinary achievement, and I think it's something that demonstrates the leadership and success of Professor Makgoba. I first met Professor Makgoba when he arrived at Wits in 1994. I was a Senate representative on the University Council at the time, and we were told that Wits had found a worthwhile successor to our Vice-Chancellor at the time, Bob Charlton, who was a medical man. And Professor Makgoba, it was whispered in the corridors, was a veritable black Charlton. William was a breath of fresh air on the campus and rapidly irked the establishment with his racialized comments on governance at Wits. And again, in preparation, I went through the articles on transformation process that you wrote at the time. In these short period of 4 years, there were 40 different articles. And these are some of the titles of them. In 1995, in the Sowetan, Enhance African Culture. In 1995, in the Star, Wits should capture the essence of Africa. In 1995, in the Star again, Africa must shed Euro ethos. In 1996, in the Higher Education Review, university leaders way out of touch. In 1996, again, in the Higher Education Review, diversity is vital to university education. Again, in the Higher Education Review, academic standards, a myth or a reality. And then finally, in Frontiers of Freedom, universities, Africanize or perish. Now, you can imagine my colleagues got increasingly agitated by these interventions. And two incidents stand out in my recollection of Professor Makgoba's arrival at Wits. The first is his appearance at his first meeting, Senate meeting. Dressed, as Dr. Clutie has mentioned, in this beautiful Saudi Arabian type prince outfit. I hope you've still got it. Yeah. You should have come in it today. Huh? Too. Yeah, I mean, I think that you've got to, if I may, Madam Chair, just try and capture the moment. I mean, we had this very dignified and a rather nervous group of aging white men in the Senate waiting to meet our first black Vice-Chancellor. And they were so, the Vice-Chancellor, Bob Johnson, was so astounded by William's appearance that he was absolutely tongue-tied and said nothing. And in the first 20 minutes of the Senate, nothing was said about the presence of our new Deputy Vice-Chancellor. So I passed him a note, the Vice-Chancellor. I said, Professor Johnson, you've forgotten to introduce our new Deputy Vice-Chancellor. And he took the note, he looked at it, and he jumped up and he said, I'd like to introduce. And then he introduced. Anyway, that sort of stuck in my mind. The second was his attempt to mediate in a student protest. I remember it well, William, because you were pulled out of a chairing a selection committee in your first week at Wits, and you were summoned to the 11th floor, where the Vice-Chancellor asked you your advice on how to deal with these protesting students. Those days they had this imaginative tactic of trashing the campus. And they had also occupied the registrar's office and were sitting there in a very kind of mild, reflective mood. And William's response, which to me seemed eminently responsible, was let's mediate. However, there were some very, I won't identify people at this point, very, how can I describe it? Let's call them energetic advisors to the Vice-Chancellor, and said, there's no way you can mediate in a university. This is not a factory. Don't be influenced by this chap Webster. You think this is an industrial relations issue. Yeah. You can't mediate it. Get the police, call the police. And of course the police came storming on campus and kicked down the door and charged the students with kidnapping. Well, and technically speaking, of course, if you hold somebody against their will, and there was this terrified registrar, by the way, apparently never recovered from this experience, this registrar, surrounded by these, for him, were these sort of menacing black men, and Professor Makgoba was quite rightly outraged by this crude response of the university to what is a relatively mild and given the nature of our times, a negotiating opportunity, really. He was so outraged, but that when these fellows were charged in the Johannesburg court for kidnapping, which, by the way, is a very serious offence, it's a compulsory jail sentence, he gave evidence in their defence. By the way, so did I. You remember that. Of course, it was okay for me to do it, but because I wasn't part of the 11th floor, but the university was outraged by this disloyal act. And I'm just mentioning those because at the time, at Wits, there were three competing narratives on governance. You had essentially a conservative liberal narrative concerned to defend standards. I mean, that was the kind of key issue. And as it was put to me once, I won't again mention names, in the common room at Wits, there are too many M's on the list. M's? Different African names. This is a problem. It's a problem. How do you maintain standards in an institution, and it was a very defensive position. I'll just call them conservative liberal, and maybe it's being a bit generous. Professor Makgoba represented a second narrative, an insurgent Africanism, critical of white dominance. There was, I would suggest, a third, somewhat marginal narrative, which I'll call the radical tradition. Now, the radical tradition, incidentally, at Wits has deep roots. Don't forget our prized student, Nelson Mandela, but Joe Slovo, Harold Walpe, David Webster, and others. A genuine non-racialism and a commitment to greater equality. Sadly, before Professor Hope had time to build alliances with the radical tradition, if you like, at Wits, a group of senior members, 13 of them, ambushed him. Ambushed him and publicly questioned his academic credentials and administrative competence. I believe a grave injustice was done to Professor Makgoba. I said so at the time. I repeat it again today. A deeply disturbing incident where his academic credentials were questioned. Professor Makgoba was deeply hurt by this unfair attack on his academic integrity. But I think it is a measure of the man that he went on to develop a distinguished career in higher education. He went on from Wits to the Medical Research Council, where he showed enormous courage in challenging that mad moment in our country when the nature of HIV/AIDS was questioned by the president. He challenged the president, and then of course he came to the University of KwaZulu-Natal at a very difficult time of the merger. But it was not only Professor Makgoba who was damaged by that incident at Wits. So were his accusers. None of them ever went on to play a role in Wits governance, or indeed in any other. And sadly, one of them, the most talented, committed suicide. The lesson I draw from this incident is that transformation of the university is a slow and complex process. And the question I would like to raise today is this: are the critiques that Professor Makgoba made of teaching, of learning, of researching 20 years ago, are they still valid today? Or could it be argued that our universities are being steadily transformed? That's the question, a framing question really for today's discussion. In Makgoba affair, that Professor Potgieter has already referred to, a reflection on transformation published in 1997, he wrote, about Wits and about the incident. Wits must realize that the cultural ethos that apparently served the institution so well in the past must change to accommodate other cultural values. The curricula have to change fundamentally as the university comes to terms with the reality that it is educating all South Africans in Africa. Africans in particular do not come to university to escape or erase their Africanness, but to confirm and articulate their roots. I'd like to repeat that last, not to escape or erase their Africanness, but to confirm and articulate their roots. In a recent article in the Mail and Guardian, Neo Lachotla Lacha Rampopa, a researcher at the Council of Higher Education, argued quite unequivocally that we have failed to transform our universities, and that, I quote, there have been few substantial paradigm shifts meant to bring about a meaningful decolonization of the curriculum and content, unquote. Indeed, this researcher goes on to describe the post-apartheid period as a lost opportunity to de-Europeanize curriculums and scholarship, unquote. I think this verdict is a bit harsh. And clearly, progress has been made. And indeed, under the leadership of Professor Makgoba, substantial progress has been made at UKZN, if you like, in decolonizing the curriculum and content. And the introduction of a compulsory course in Zulu is one example. I assume that this came out of your period as Vice-Chancellor. I assume that it's an experimental phase because it's the first year. But I think the idea behind that is so self-evidently necessary that it is quite surprising when you think about it that it's never been introduced before. In fact, I want to take it a step further and suggest to the Vice-Chancellor, Professor van Jaarsveld, that to introduce students such as my own population group simply to the language of Zulu is only half the walnut. You really have to accompany that to make it meaningful with some historical, cultural, societal context, not just of Africans, obviously, but the rich mosaic that constitutes this country. I'm astounded about the ignorance we have of each other. So so rather than see it as something that is a complete, it really should be seen as the first step and expanded, I think. And I really think that having played the pioneering role, that UKZN ought to take it a step further. It is a curious thing, but there is no university. There is no university in Africa that doesn't have as its language European language. French, Portuguese, English, Arabic, okay, in the north. But I think it's a step in that direction. This is important, I believe, as it signals that transformation is more than a change in the racial demography. I think this is an important point because I think a lot of the criticisms that Professor Makgoba's experienced is that he's over-concerned with race. But focusing on Zulu language is not about race. It's about cultural differences. It's got nothing to do with race. It's about understanding the diversity around it. It's a recognition of diversity. For me, the biggest danger in the age of globalization is a kind of false or pseudo-universalism. The idea that there's a sort of homogeneous world that sort of people speak English and behave in certain ways. I believe that it's only through an understanding of our different histories that we can arrive at an understanding of the many voices in our society. We need to remind ourselves that path-breaking cultural creativity in world history has often come not from the center, but from the periphery of cultural worlds. This is the enduring legacy of Professor Makgoba, and this is the challenge he has left his successor. How are we to find a voice? How are universities to find a voice in the global knowledge production system that is rooted in Africa, but at the same time universal? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Webster. I would take this opportunity to ask Dr. Russell Ali to come to the podium. Like I said, all the panelists' bios are in the program, so you can refer to it. He used to be at WITS. Some of you might know him from the Ford Foundation, where maybe you got some funding from him, and now he's at the University on the Hill, UCT. Thanks, Russell.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, and good morning, everyone. I don't get an opportunity to travel much to KwaZulu-Natal anymore these days, since I left the Ford Foundation. So it's nice to visit again. I used to come here in my role as program staff for Ford, for some of the programs that Ford was supporting here at the university. So some of it is familiar, but that's been many years. Now, so first, two disclaimers, okay? And I must say there was a little bit of nervousness at the place on the Hill when I put in my request for special leave as to what the purpose was. Nevertheless, so two disclaimers. First, the first is this is not a panegyric. This is not a praise singing exercise, but it is also not a case of damning with faint praise. So it's somewhere in the middle, and I thought that what would be most useful would be to focus on the issues which were and which I still think have animated Professor Makgoba's, William Melegapura's thinking and approach to transformation, and based on the time that we spent together at the University of the Witwatersrand. Incidentally, I was the chairperson of the Academic Staff Association, and my first encounter with Melegapuru was in the interviewing panel, and I don't remember if you remember the question that I asked you. You know, why would you want to come to a place like WITS? I won't tell them what your answer was. So I really want to reflect on some of the issues that I think animated his thinking. Transformation, I think, cuts very deep into the entire fabric of our society. In some ways, we can actually think of transformation as the bedrock of our democracy. One of the fundamental reasons, actually, for the struggle against the old apartheid system. So fundamental to transformation, then, I believe, is freedom. Freedom and the dignity that comes with being recognized and accepted as a human being in the full and complete meaning of the word. That ineradicable right to what we call humanity. So it is no secret that the person we are focusing on today has had his fair share of controversy. First at WITS, where he came as Deputy Vice Chancellor, and you've heard quite a bit about that. And then, of course, at